It all starts in quite an unusual way. The protagonist of the story wakes up in the middle of an alley, completely bewildered by the situation. He begins to walk through the surrounding streets, and upon reaching a busy avenue, wonders exactly where he is. The people around him, surprised, watch closely as he walks by. Some whisper, questioning what a noble would be doing in a place like this and whether he is acting incognito. The protagonist, in turn, realizes he understands the language spoken there, but does not fully grasp the context of the conversations. While a woman buys fruits, he approaches without ceremony. The vendor and the customer turn to him, visibly tense. However, the protagonist simply greets them naturally and continues on, still confused. He mutters to himself that he has never seen coins like those before. Moreover, despite being an apparently vast country, he cannot determine where he is. After walking around the city for quite a while, he encounters people of all kinds. He observes a group wielding swords and wearing armor discussing a labyrinth. The protagonist assumes they are mercenaries, although he does not notice any clear signs that the country is about to go to war. Curious to gather information, he decides to sell some of his belongings. At that moment, he spots a hunter's shop and decides to enter. The vendor greets him warmly, but becomes nervous upon realizing he is dealing with a noble. The protagonist greets him and asks if he is open for business. The vendor answers yes, although internally he questions why a noble would be in his shop. Suddenly, the protagonist mentions he wishes to sell something, and the vendor says he will need to assess the item first. The protagonist then pulls out his sword and places it on the counter, starting to observe the products for sale. His eyes land on a map he does not recognize at all. While examining it, he hears the vendor compliment the sword's decoration, saying the design is impressive and never seen before. Realizing he has spoken too much, the vendor apologizes for his lack of manners. The protagonist reassures him, stating he would not mind a simple compliment. He then asks how much he would offer for the sword. The vendor replies that he can pay 200 gold coins. Without hesitation, the protagonist agrees, and a few seconds later, a pile of coins appears on the table. He thanks him but asks if there is something to keep them safe. The vendor presents several models of coin pouches. Seizing the occasion, the protagonist also asks to buy the map hanging on the wall. The vendor agrees, but first inquires which pouch he prefers. The protagonist leaves the choice to him, which makes the man even more nervous. After selecting the accessory, the vendor explains how to store the coins. He is surprised to see it in action. Nevertheless, the vendor comments that models with special enchantments are more expensive and have fewer options available. Hearing the word magic, the protagonist wonders if it is very different from sorcery. Soon after, he is seen walking again through the streets. He observes how much the atmosphere of that place resembles the country he came from. However, this similarity also makes him feel that he does not belong there. Thinking again about gathering information, he concludes that he needs to find someone willing to help him, someone unafraid to speak their mind and possessing a minimum sense of morality, and be perceptive enough to understand what is not said directly. As he pondered this, a man interrupted him. The protagonist asked what he wanted. The dark-haired man merely warned him to avoid that alley. The protagonist thanked him, but when the man turned to leave, he threw a coin in his direction. The man easily caught it and asked what he wanted. The protagonist apologized, introduced himself as Lizel, and said he only wanted to talk. As he spoke, he dropped some more coins, prompting the man to command him to follow. Thus, they arrived at a bar. The dark-haired man asked the bartender to reserve a table in the back. Along the way, Lizel greeted the attendant, who also watched him strangely. Once seated, they served him a drink. The man asked what Lizel wanted to know, but before that, Lizel requested that he introduce himself, as merely exchanging information would be too dull. He suggested discussing his profession, past relationships, or any other topic just to get to know each other better. With little choice, the man said his name was Gil, a solo adventurer of rank B. He had never had a girlfriend and had no interest in having one. He defined himself as a true lone wolf, cold and without emotional attachment. Upon hearing this, Lizel concluded that the armed people he saw in town were likely adventurers as well. Lizel commented that, even without wanting a relationship, women must certainly not be lacking for him. Gil replied that he could believe whatever. He wanted and viewed that as a compliment. At that moment, Gil became more attentive, curious to discover who Lizel really was, being the only rank B adventurer who operated alone. Even so, he did not feel intimidated by his presence. Gil did not know if Lizel was truly powerful or just an inexperienced, naive noble in the world. Lizel took a sip of his drink and commented that Gil seemed quite intelligent, asking if his impression was correct. Gil then questioned whether Lizel also intended to answer the questions he would ask. Lizelle inquired how far his curiosity extended, and Gil answered that he wanted to know everything, including the details of his love life. Lizelle started by saying that he did not have any job or anything that proved his status or position in society. Regarding his history with women, he remarked that a true knight does not hold on to such memories. Gil did not feel that he was lying, but also thought that it wasn't exactly a friendly introduction, to which Lizelle responded that it was due to Gil not asking the right questions. Nonetheless, Gil stated that he did not intend to distrust him or investigate his identity further, although he admitted to feeling a certain curiosity. At that moment, Lizelle suggested they get straight to the point, pulling out a map and laying it on the table. To start, he asked Gil to explain the situation of the region indicated on the map. Gil commented that they were near the capital of the Kingdom of Marcaday, a trading country. Meanwhile, Cabana is known as the nation of magical minerals. He explained that a long time ago Marcaday and Cabana had some conflicts, but lately, the situation has been more peaceful. Obviously, it is clear what the trading nation is doing. Cabana must have abundant resources. Natural and great minds, he asks what Gil thinks of part of the capital. Gil finds the question too vague and feels a bit lazy to answer. Still, Lizelle asks for just a brief opinion, saying that would be enough. Gil replies that there are good facilities, tasty food, and that the work is not bad. Furthermore, it's a comfortable place for adventurers. This leads Lizelle to conclude that many people come and go from the capital constantly, which means that practically no one would draw attention. Then Lizelle says that he initially only intended to ask some questions, but ends up asking for a favor. Gil comments that he accepts, since the payment for the information was too high, and jokes by asking if he wants him to be his guide, bodyguard, or just an accompanying adventurer. Gil was just joking, but the cheeky Lizelle replies that he wants all of that at the same time. The dark-haired man asks at least that he disguise it better, questioning if that was really what he wanted. Lizelle confirms, but says the final decision is solely up to Gil. Gil sighs and asks how long he intends to hire him. Lizelle replies that for now it will only be for 1 month. In the first few days, Gil should stay with him and explain many things. After that, he will only accompany him when necessary. Gil obviously does not intend to work for free and asks how much he will receive for all of this. Lizelle shows his negotiator side and asks how much effort Gil is willing to put in. Gil takes this as a joke and accepts, asking who he thinks he is talking to. Thus, Lizelle closes the deal, making his first request. After that, they rent some rooms so that Lizelle has a place to spend the night. Gil sits down and asks if he is finally going to explain everything now. Lizelle affirms that yes, making it clear that everything he will tell is absolutely true. Gil believes that, after all, he would have nothing to gain by lying. Lizelle tells that he arrived in that kingdom knowing nothing, and that he comes from a place that simply does not exist. There, he does not know if everything happened by chance or if it was someone's doing. He remembers talking to a subordinate and suddenly appearing in an alley of that place. Since he arrived, he has walked through various points of the city, and everything is very similar to his country of origin. This makes the situation even stranger, as if the world itself were off-kilter. He says he will speak from this premise and that, if Gil does not believe him, he can simply leave him there. Gil asks him to continue. Lizelle asks if he believes his story, and the dark-haired man replies that it would be a stupid lie. Then, putting the jokes aside, he calls him Mr. Aristocrat and asks him to introduce himself. With no other choice, Lizelle reveals that he just inherited his title, which is actually a duke, and that he holds the position of chancellor. Upon hearing this, Gil asks if that means he is the king's right hand. Lizelle confirms, which surprises Gil. After all, he seems too young. Lizelle adds that his king was so extraordinary that he never made his age seem like a problem. Gil asks if he cannot return to his kingdom, and Lizelle replies that he doesn't know. However, he is sure that if problems arise without him, they will find a way to bring him back. In light of this, Gil questions why he himself does not seek a solution. Lizelle admits that it's tempting, but prefers to leave it in the hands of his king, as that is his specialty. Until then, he decides to treat everything like a vacation and enjoy it. The next day, he wakes up early and goes to knock on Gil's door. Gil asks if he wants to go somewhere, and the protagonist responds that he wishes to become an adventurer. At first, Gil doubts, but upon realizing he is serious, agrees to accompany him to buy equipment. After that, they head to the guild. Gil explains the basics. Adventurers take on jobs requested by others, and the guild acts as an intermediary. They then approach the receptionist, who informs them that the guild master is not present and asks them to return another day. Lizelle clarifies that he is there to register at the guild. The receptionist, named Stud, asks if Single Blade did not explain anything. This confuses Lizelle. Then, the receptionist explains that this is the nickname of the man with black hair. Gil makes it clear that he did not choose this nickname, but putting that aside, the receptionist explains that the guild has the right to refuse government interference, and thus does not accept registrations from nobles, knights, or the like, asking Lizelle to leave. Gil insists that is not what he thinks because that guy is not a noble. The receptionist does not believe him, but Gil insists. With no more objections, the receptionist agrees to assist him. With everything ready, the man introduces himself as Stud and asks the protagonist to prick his finger with an object. Lizelle complies and sees a drop of blood fall onto a leaf, causing it to start glowing. After this, he thinks about licking his finger, but Gil immediately stops him and scolds him for being so careless. With everything completed, Studley hands him the guild wallet and then picks up some books to explain how job requests work. He mentions that the guild provides encyclopedias with information about monsters and plants that can be requested on missions. If questions arise, they can be consulted or asked directly at the reception. Lizelle asks if these encyclopedias are for sale. Studley replies that no, but they can be consulted for free. Additionally, he warns that it is strictly forbidden to remove any book from the guild building. With that said, he takes a small piece of paper and draws a map indicating a bookstore that sells all kinds and specialties of books. Liesel thanks him and as a gesture of gratitude pets his head before saying goodbye. Everyone in the guild is shocked, asking if he really just petted the head of the absolute zero. Stud touches his own head, confused, wondering what just happened. 3 days later, we see Lizelle reading peacefully. At that moment, Gil knocks on the door and enters the room. Lizelle greets him and asks how it went with what he had requested. The man with black hair replies that everything went well, and questions whether Lizelle does not tire of reading so much. Gil then picks up a book and reads the first paragraph he finds. Lizelle continues the narrative from memory, making it clear that he has read all those books, and asks if he enjoyed the reading. Gil comments that it sounded more like a bunch of nonsense to him. After that, they close the books. Liesel observes that it is almost lunchtime. Then he suggests they go eat and after that head to the guild. Gil asks if he's finally planning to accept a job, and Liesel confirms. Upon arriving, Liesel greets Stud, who obviously remembers him. After all, how could he forget the noble who patted him on the head? Lizelle sits down and states that he's back to hear the rest of the explanations on how to accept quests. At that moment, another adventurer loudly comments, looking strangely at Gil, saying that the unique sword has really declined, as he wanted to see who had joined the famous adventurer and ended up finding just a delicate-looking young noble. Both Gil and Liesel ignore him, while Stud hands Liesel a list of the guild's rules. The adventurer continues to complain to Gil, saying that he declined his invitation to join a rookie, questioning what he has in his head. Gil merely glares at him with disdain and asks who he thinks he is. This obviously irritates the adventurer. Gil makes it clear that he shouldn't be talking to him, as they don't know each other and are not friends. In light of this, the adventurer makes an indecent remark, insinuating whether Lizelle was worth it. Coldly, Gil replies that at least Lizelle is better than him. Stud and Lizelle hear this. Lizelle comments that Gil's contract was for a month, but that perhaps it would be better to wrap things up right there. Stud then calls the adventurer indecent. Still, for Lizelle, it's a problem to speak ill of Gil. The adventurer asks what was said. Lizelle stands up from his chair, faces him directly, and clarifies that he and Gil teamed up because they made an agreement. The adventurer calls him arrogant for having bought the unique sword, and now thinking he's important. Lizelle questions whether he truly believes Gil would sell himself for a few coins. If that's the case, he challenges him to pay more than he did at that moment, though he doubts he could convince him. This infuriates the adventurer, who boasts that he is also a rank B adventurer, just like Gil. Upon hearing this, Lizelle congratulates him. The adventurer starts laughing, thinking he has won the argument. However, Lizelle feels deeply troubled by the fact that someone of that ilk dares to compare themselves to something that, for him, belongs to Gil. This causes the adventurer to lose control, draw his sword, and curse at him. He immediately lunges to attack, but Stud stands up, and Gil steps in front, blocking the strike and breaking the opponent's sword in half. The adventurer is left with his mouth agape. Then, Gil spins and delivers a powerful kick, sending him crashing against the wall. At that moment, Lizelle looks at Stud and realizes he's about to use magic. Grabbing his wrist, Lizelle stops him, reminding him that guild staff cannot get involved in fights between adventurers. Stud cancels the magic and explains that he can only intervene if called upon as an arbitrator, but that it is not prohibited. Lizelle understands and says he was worried about possible punishment. He then hands over money to cover the repairs to the wall and asks to leave the work matter for another day, withdrawing from the guild and returning to their quarters. Gil drinks a glass of liquor and recalls how his body moved instinctively, protecting Lizelle without even thinking. He also remembers the adventurer's words about wanting to compare himself to his rank, but mainly the fact that Lysol said he belongs to him. In light of this, Gil just laughs, saying it's not like he's his knight. On a new day, we see everyone having breakfast. Lysol praises the good taste of the food, something Gil doesn't quite believe. Suddenly, the captain of the knights bursts into the place, asking for a man who would be posing as a noble and staying there. The owner of the place gets irritated and asks him not to accuse her, customers, of such strange things, but the captain insists and requests permission to check if the information is true. At that moment, he sees our protagonist having tea. He freezes and, mistaking him for a noble, apologizes for his rudeness. Lysol reassures him and clarifies that he is not a noble, but rather an adventurer. The captain asks her not to believe it and tells him not to lie. After this, Lyselle and Gil go for a walk in the forest, starting another day as adventurers. Our protagonist comments that he hopes to learn a lot from him. Once again, Gil asks him to stop talking that way, as if he keeps it up, he won't pass for an adventurer. Liesel understands and then asks him to teach him many things, commenting that this also doesn't suit him. Changing the subject, he points in a direction where there is a rat. Liesel is surprised both by the life in that world and by the huge size of the rat. Gil explains that it is a prairie rat, a monster. If they kill 10 that day, they will complete the mission, but since they are very fast, caution will be needed. Our protagonist doesn't even catch that last part, and, invoking a magical weapon, takes care of the rat. Gil asks if he can't go a single minute without scaring people. Lizelle apologizes and asks if he got scared. Gil responds that anyone would be surprised if something like that suddenly appeared and fired. Lizelle asks if guns in that world shoot lead bullets. Gil confirms and mentions that they are very difficult to use. In that case, Liesel comments that his is different while putting the gun to his own head. Gil quickly puts his hand up, but no damage occurs when the shot happens. Liesel explains that the bullets from that gun are not lead, but magical. He demonstrates this by defeating 2 more rats, and so they continue with the mission. At the end, they return to the guild and choose another mission. They see one that consists of collecting items up to the 5th level of the labyrinth for a certain labyrinth collector, requiring an evaluation certificate with a base reward of 10 silver coins. The guild attendant comments that their rank is appropriate for reaching the 5th level and that under those conditions, the reward is good. Thus, Lizelle decides to accept it. He goes to the studio and sits down, showing the mission, while the black-haired boy registers the request and asks if he has any questions. Lizelle asks if any object is really acceptable. Study confirms, explaining that as so long as it's something found only in the labyrinth, everything is valid. This seems perfect for Liesel. Then he asks what the others are doing there. Stud reveals that they found a new labyrinth a few days ago and that they plan to cross it, but it has been very difficult. Since they've been staring at the table in silence for hours, Gil asks what the point is. Stud clarifies that the difficulty isn't the monsters, but the puzzles, as they say the place is full of very complex riddles and they want to solve them as soon as possible. Gil understands they are seeking the bonus for completing the labyrinth. Liesel asks what that means, and Gil explains that it is a reward the labyrinth grants only to the first group that manages to complete it. Stud adds that being among the first to achieve this also affects their rank. Currently, there are hardly any adventurers taking jobs. He tells our protagonist that if he's interested, he could check out those tables since that's where the first cryptogram appears. Liesel asks Gil for his opinion, but he says not to think about it, as their fate is already decided. Thus, with the registration ready, they were about to leave, but Liesel feels curious and asks for a moment to take a look. Accordingly, she approaches a blonde guy and, upon reading his notes, whispers that these are numbers from a very ancient language, and they are very well organized. After saying this, she steps back. The guy looks confused. His companions ask if he had any information stolen. The blonde replies that no, on the contrary. Then we see our protagonist walking through the forest. Lizelle can't help but think about those ancient letters, as she knows them very well. Intrigued, she wonders if that world is the past or the present of hers. After a few minutes, they arrive at the labyrinth. Gil opens the door and they both enter its interior. Lazio walks calmly in search of items. Gil comments that everything is entirely random and that all they can do is walk. Liesel asks if there's a boss at the deepest level. Gil confirms, but makes it clear that it's not very strong. Suddenly, an arrow is fired. Immediately, Gil protects our protagonist. She asks why he thinks the mechanism was activated with her. Gil replies that he doesn't know, but that she should still be more careful while walking through that place. As they descend some stairs, they reach a room that has 2 chests. Gil comments that they were very lucky for them to appear already on the 2nd level. Our protagonist opens one of the chests and finds something unusual. They go back to the evaluator from the beginning, hand over 2 stuffed animals, and ask for his opinion on the price he would put on the items. He hesitates and finally says they're not worth much, but he could buy them. Lizelle replies, "No, thanks," and only asks for a certificate proving their value as labyrinth items. Thinking about how to hand them over, she gets the idea to wrap them in gift paper with a bow. So, at night, we see the gifts at the guild's reception, with Stud taking care of them in his room. Liesel comments to Gil about the guys from the morning, those she helped with the cryptogram. While they were talking about that, at that moment, the very subjects appear, in front of the lodging. Now we see them gathered. The group's leader introduces himself as Egg and asks for our protagonist's help to advance to the next stage of the labyrinth. Liesel demands 50% of the total reward, something that the other considers absurd. In light of that, our protagonist reminds them that she earns nothing. If only to help them, he makes it clear that if they want, he himself can go to the labyrinth the next day. Upon hearing this, Ain gets nervous and ends up agreeing to pay half the amount the next day. While our protagonist was sleeping, Ain and his group enter his room with Gil's permission. Lizelle asks for the note and after reading everything, asks him to come closer. Still almost asleep, he explains what needs to be done. The blonde young man starts taking frantic notes, but the protagonist ends up falling asleep in the middle of the explanation. Later, Lizelle and Gil meet at the guild, observing the available jobs. Lizelle realizes that until now, no one has requested bodyguards. Gil comments not to even bother, as you need to be rank C to accept this type of mission. At that moment, Study appears asking for a moment with our protagonist and explains that the person who requested the job the other day came to the guild and wants to meet him, as he was so satisfied with what he received that he wants to thank him personally. Thus, our protagonists accompany him and wait in a private room. Suddenly, a well-dressed blonde man enters the room. Seeing our protagonist, he thinks there must have been a mistake, but Study corrects him. Our protagonist greets him and introduces himself as the person who accepted his request. The man is surprised, saying he has never seen an adventurer like him before. He invites him to sit down and introduces himself as Ray, a Viscount, and commander of the military police. Getting straight to the point, he tells our protagonist that he is deeply grateful for giving him the opportunity to see such well-wrapped objects. After having some tea, he leaves a gold coin on the table and asks him to accept it as payment for the thrill he felt. Lizelle also drinks the tea, and placing the cup on the coin, says that he accepts the extra payment. Ray observes this, and standing up, extends his hand, saying that he would like them to get along. Lizelle thanks him, but comments that it's too much for a rank F adventurer. Ray clarifies that he's not referring to that. Touching his own chest, he says he simply wants to be his friend on a personal level. In response, Lizelle agrees. We then notice that the blonde man reveals a strange expression. He tells our protagonist that he would like to invite him to his house someday, to show him his collection. Without further ado, he bids farewell. Alone, Lizelle comments to Gil that with that, it seems, he has cleared the suspicions they had about him. Gil asks how he can be so sure. Lizelle points to his own chest and says he examined him before he left. The scene shifts to Ray, who, looking at his own hand, comments that our protagonist did not change and apparently did not feel even a drop of fear, something he considers perfect to start building a friendship. At night, Lizelle and Gil are drinking together. The protagonist comments that Ain and his group managed to be the first to complete the labyrinth and that he came out winning from it. He asks Gil if that amount is considered a lot. Gil replies that it would only be enough to buy equipment of a rank above his. Then, Lizelle asks why Gil is rank B. Gil responds that he likes to work alone. However, Lizelle doesn't fully believe it. Gil then comments that rank A adventurers or above tend to have a lot of contact with nobles, which means having to behave like them, something he finds extremely annoying. Lizelle understands then, watching him drink his wine. Liesel hands him his monthly payment, along with an extra amount as a reserve, saying she would like him to help her the next time she needs something. While doing this, she is about to take a sip of her own drink, but Gil causes it to spill. Liesel asks him to let go. When he doesn't comply, she politely asks again, stating that she doesn't want to have to order him to do anything. He clarifies that he doesn't want to tie her up, but in saying this, Gil grabs her by her clothing and makes it clear that this was a decision of his own because it's what he wants. Therefore, Liesel has no reason to interfere. After clarifying this, he sits down and returns the money, asking for just one thing in return, that Liesel not bother him. Liesel smiles and promises to make an effort to rise to his level. The next day, we see Liesel and Gil in a carriage. Gil notices that the coachman is very helpful and imagines that he also mistook Liesel for a noble. The protagonist doesn't blame him, knowing they are headed towards the mansion. Here we see what happened a few hours earlier, while Liesel and Gil were at the guild. An adventurer asks another if it's true that the Thrust has formed a group, and now they confirm that it is. While Stud writes a document, he asks Liesel if he is sure about this. Liesel responds by asking if that seems wrong to him. Stud states that it doesn't, but he says he won't oppose whatever he decides. When Stud looks at Gil, he asks if he thinks he has already grown fond of him. Stud replies that he hasn't said anything, but also won't expose him to danger just because he is no longer his bodyguard. Gil pretends not to understand, then Stud takes Liesel's hand and shows the mark he left on her wrist. Liesel jokes, saying that Gil cried not to be left after handing over his identification. Stud mentions that he has something else to give him, a letter that seems to be addressed to him. Upon seeing it, Liesel realizes it was sent by the king and wonders if this isn't an abuse of authority. Stud comments that, since it's a personal letter, they cannot refuse it. After reading the letter, Liesel hands it to Gil. In it, they are invited to the king's mansion to see his valuable collection. Since they have already been invited, Liesel decides to go, especially out of a curiosity for the collection of labyrinth items, particularly since he has never gotten anything good. Stud comments that they can use the carriage service from the central district and that they can go today, since the Viscount will surely let them in. Thus, we return to the present. At the entrance, a butler greets them and leads them inside. On the way, Liesel is impressed by the number of paintings in the room. At one point, he sees a painting of a green dragon that catches his attention. Shortly after, Ray appears, thanking them for coming to see his precious collection, and saying that he would like the three of them to become good friends, asking them to treat him as a common person. Liesel tries, but remains very formal, while Gil is more natural, telling Ray that he is a nuisance. Thus, they begin the tour. Liesel asks if all those are items from the labyrinths and if the people depicted in the paintings are real. Ray replies that yes, and they can be seen as records of the labyrinths. For Gil, they are just unwanted objects by adventurers, which are sometimes left behind, even when something rare appears. For the king, this is regrettable. For some are worth more than many jewels. There are also paintings that are highly valued for depicting what is now considered a master, a mystery of a labyrinth, or even Liesel and Gil showing that he dedicated a painting to them. Liesel comments on how good Gil looks in the portrait. The young man with black hair asks him to be quiet. Then Ray comments that it cost him a fortune. Liesel moves closer to better appreciate the painting and remarks that strong adventurers seem to be very popular. Ray agrees, saying that strength is important, but not as much as good looks, since even ladies compete at auctions. Embarrassed, Gil asks him to stop it once and for all. Liesel thanks them for not valuing character, as otherwise no one would appreciate Gil. He then wonders if there will ever be a painting of him, although this also scares him a little at the thought that it might end up in the hands of a stranger. Ray assures him that if one ever exists, he will pay whatever it takes to obtain it. Saying this, Ray hands him a letter. Liesel asks why, and the blonde replies that it is a talisman for when they visit Marquette. Liesel hesitates to accept, as he doesn't believe an adventurer of his level will have this opportunity. Ray assures him that this moment will come, thus Liesel accepts the gift. Putting that aside, they go to see the rest of the collection. On a new day, we see the protagonist walking through the city. People greet him politely, calling him Noble Sir. At first, Liesel clarifies that he is not, but eventually grows tired of denying it and begins to accept it. Next, he arrives at the appraiser's shop, where he is congratulated for having formed a group, and Liesel thanks him. Then, changing the subject, he takes out an artifact and asks for it to be appraised. The brown-haired man examines it and says it is an infallible hourglass, an artifact that is not affected by the position in which it is placed. Liesel laments not being able to get typical adventurer items. For George, that is not a problem, as he finds it wonderful to see new artifacts. Liesel, with his usual confidence, pets his head while praising him. While looking at other objects, he mentions that a few days ago, a collector showed him his painting collection and expresses a desire to know if they often appear in the shop. George reveals that they do. Then, Lizelle comments that there was a painting of Gil that seemed very expensive. George is startled just imagining Gil posing, but upon seeing Lizelle's expression, begins to imagine how he would look in a painting. Amidst this, Lizelle asks if he does not buy the paintings he appraises. George responds that he does. After all, he has a distributor. Lizelle asks what that is. George then explains that there are specialty shops for labyrinth paintings, but they are located in Market. Liesel notes that this place is very far away. Seeing him deep in thought, George asks if he plans to go there. In response, Liesel asks to know why that intrigues him. George reveals that his grandfather lives there and that he will soon visit him. Therefore, if they plan to go to that place, he would like them to escort him. Liesel makes it clear that he has never worked as a guard, so he considers that it would be best to ask someone with more experience. George lowers his head and, very embarrassed, comments that he wants it to be them. For now, Lizelle doesn't agree, but promises to talk to Gil to reach an agreement. That said, he leaves alone. George sighs in relief, saying he doesn't believe Lizelle is just a kind person. Now we return to the guild. Lysol tells Stud that the boy from the shop will soon send them a request. Stud acknowledges that he is referring to Yuji, as they sometimes ask for his help in evaluating objects from the maze. It all started when the guild asked for his grandfather's help. The old man was famous for making accurate appraisals until the day he brought George as a child. It is said that at that age, he already had great skills in evaluating. Since he and Stud were the same age, they talked occasionally, although he made it clear that they were not friends. Setting that aside, Stud talks about the trip to Mars, and when Lizelle asks him if he plans to settle there, he replies that he will only be a tourist, as he doesn't know the place. Stud knows that they won't see each other for a while, and asks if Lizelle will accept any work that day. When Lizelle replies that he won't, Stud asks him to accompany him during the break to a place that serves delicious coffee. Lizelle gladly accepts, even though Stud's colleagues look at him strangely. Once at the place, Lizelle asks if Stud doesn't usually take breaks, and he replies that if he's not tired, he sees no need, and asks if it was rude to talk about something other than work. Lizelle says no, and that, in fact, it made him happy. At that moment, Stud notices that the bruise on his wrist is no longer there. Liesel comments that Gil didn't really squeeze him. Stud says he would have liked to see the guard crying not to let him go. This amuses Liesel, who comments on how good the coffee is until other adventurers arrive looking for the protagonist because he is the guy who allied with Gil. They warn that if he is paying to stay with him, he better give up. The whole place goes silent until Lizelle gets up. He asks to talk outside, apologizing to Stud for what happened, but Stud coldly responds that he wants to spend his time with Lizelle. The protagonist says they can come another day, but that if it's to happen, it has to be now, and that he will do whatever it takes to make him stay there. The adventurers get annoyed at being ignored and bang on the table, mocking and saying that they are such good friends. Stud replies that yes, they are very close, and that if they keep interrupting, he will end their lives by freezing their arms. He warns that if they don't melt quickly, they will lose their hands, and thus makes them leave. Lizelle remarks to Stud that he shouldn't do such dangerous things, not because he will lose, but because he cares about him. Now outside the city, Stud warns George to come back as soon as possible and gives him a slap on the head for not knowing how to answer correctly, joking that he only grew taller. Once everyone is in the carriage, Stud asks them to take care of themselves, and Liesel replies that they will return soon. During the journey, George comments that Stud is always a bit sarcastic with him. Lizelle says that this happens because they get along very well. He also mentions how comfortable the carriage is. George thanks him, but then Liesel asks if he really needs it, even with space magic. The brown-haired boy explains that there are many materials and tools who reject all kinds of magic. Liesel shows interest upon hearing this and asks him to show him some of those items another day. Enjoying the breeze, Liesel comments on how relaxing it is. Gil says that this is not good at all and, yawning, mentions that it doesn't sharpen the senses. Liesel asks if he is talking about sensing presences, that thing he always mentions, but which he cannot feel. Gil replies that it comes with practice. To achieve this, he would have to spend time in a place where, if he didn't feel anything, he would die. At that moment, Gil notices a small door in the ceiling and asks George if he can open it. George replies that he just needs to push. Therefore, Gil orders him to keep leading and not be frightened. George doesn't understand what he is referring to, but at that moment, a group of green hyenas appears. George becomes a bit tense, but Liesel reassures him, promising that they will take care of it. Thus, he attempts to go through the ceiling, or rather, he tries since he cannot climb, and then he asks Gil for help. Gil reaches out his hand, Liesel grabs it, and manages to climb up. Once on the ceiling, Liesel asks George if the horses aren't scared by loud noises. The young man replies that they are not. In that case, Lizelle can't help himself, and drawing his magic weapon, fires with a precision that instantly eliminates all the hyenas. Without further ado, he thinks about going back inside, but upon noticing the height, he becomes nervous. Gil teases him, asking if he has now become a defenseless maiden. George, in turn, wonders if what he saw earlier was really a firearm, imagining the protagonist with one and assuming that it would indeed cost a fortune. When night falls, they stop to set up camp. Judge is cooking, and Lyselle wants to help, but Judge says it isn't necessary and asks if there's any food Lyselle dislikes. Lysel replies that he eats everything and comments to Gil that Judge is very skilled in the kitchen. From that remark, Gil deduces that Lysel has never cooked before, while he himself has, at least enough not to starve. Watching how Judge takes care of them, Lysel mentions that if he gets used to this, he won't be able to accept being anyone else's escort. Gil agrees. At that moment, they see Judge taking plates out of his box. To Lysel, that magic seems fantastic. Gil asks if there wasn't anything like that in his world. Lysel answers that there wasn't, and that he doesn't even want to imagine what he would do without it when he returns. Finally, the food is ready, leaving everyone amazed, since Judge prepared such a large amount using only a single frying pan. As they get ready to eat, Judge notices how elegantly Lyselle behaves at the table. Judge praises the food and asks them to sit down and eat together. After that, they talk about taking turns keeping watch to guard against bandits or monsters. Judge volunteers, but since he already drove the carriage, they don't allow it. Lyselle offers to take the first watch, saying he doesn't have trouble staying awake. Although Gil could stand watch alone, Lyselle wouldn't like that. With that decided, Judge and Gil go to sleep, and Lyselle wishes them good night. Gil asks him to let him know if anything happens, but warns that if he doesn't sleep well, he won't switch shifts. After that, Lyselle watches the stars and reads his book until he finishes it. After some time, he goes to check on Gil, who wakes up easily. Lyselle asks if he hadn't been sleeping, and Gil replies that he has trouble sleeping outdoors. Before switching shifts, Lyselle hands him the book and lies down to sleep. At dawn, Judge wakes up and goes to see Lyselle. Watching the way he sleeps, he thinks about telling Stut, although he's sure he'd get punched for it. Out of curiosity, he reaches out to touch Lyselle's face, until Gil appears and asks what he's doing. Finding it strange that Judge hadn't left even though he was awake, Gil came to check. Judge explains that it's not what it looks like, and Lyselle wakes up, looking at them both with a confused expression. After that, they continue their journey until Judge says they can already see the city. When they reach the entrance, they see carriages lined up. Judge explains that this is done for inspections before entering. Lyselle adds that the lord of those lands rose from poverty to wealth. Judge confirms it and adds that when the country was still known only as a merchant city, the current lord's grandfather received a noble title because the ruler of the time adopted him. Gil is surprised by how much Lyselle knows about history, and the protagonist explains that it's because he has read many books. Lyselle also mentions that, apparently, the current lord's ancestor was a merchant. He was highly respected by the people, had deep knowledge of all kinds of business, and in his own generation became one of the richest merchants in the country. After that, he invested large sums of money into the city, revitalizing commerce more and more. Gil assumes that the lord at the time must have been useless. Judge says he doesn't know, but he heard that the ruler had great respect for the current lord's ancestor. Lyselle imagines that this is why that noble adopted him, since the fact that merchants still trust him to this day shows how skilled he was as both a merchant and a ruler. Judge adds that, however, no one knows what the current lord is like because he doesn't appear in public, perhaps because he's busy. Still, Judge has heard rumors that he sometimes walks through the city in disguise. At that moment, the conversation is interrupted by the line moving forward. It's their turn to advance. Inside the city, Judge asks if they already have lodging. Lyselle replies that they don't yet. Hearing that, Judge offers his grandfather's house. Lyselle refuses, saying he doesn't want to be a burden and that they'll look for an inn. Judge insists, saying he can't allow them to stay in some rundown inn. Even so, the protagonist declines. With no other option, Judge hands him a card with his name and the company through which they can secure a room. Lyselle hesitates, but in the end accepts it and says goodbye, while Judge shouts that he must not accept being an escort for any other carriage. Thus, we see the protagonist walking alongside Gil. Gil scolds him for always doing whatever Judge asks. Lyselle doesn't respond because he is now surrounded by merchants trying to convince him to invest in their businesses. Lyselle shows interest, but the black-haired man pulls him away by force, suggesting that they ignore those people, otherwise things could end badly. As they move away from the area, some suspicious people watch them from the shadows. After some time, and after securing lodging, they go out to stroll through the market. At that moment, the same man from before tries to attack them. However, Gil is much faster and knocks him down, telling him to calm down. The man ignores the warning, gets back up, and curses the protagonist for ruining his business. Liesel tries to say that he's mistaken, but the man doesn't believe him, claiming that Liesel is the only noble walking around the city. This draws the attention of the people around them, including a black-haired man with an elegant posture. Fed up, Liesel asks why the man's business went bankrupt. The man replies that he doesn't know, but he's certain Liesel ruined everything over something insignificant. In response, Liesel confronts him, saying that if he couldn't fulfill something he considers so trivial, then he shouldn't open a business in that city. With his usual calm, he asks him not to blame others, and people begin to take Liesel's side. Even so, the man keeps insisting that it wasn't his fault. Liesel replies that trust is earned by following the rules, adding with a smile that the man clearly wasn't born to be a merchant. Enraged, the man attacks. Liesel asks Gil not to hurt him, so Gil throws his sword and pins the man to the ground. The crowd applauds, an impressive display of skill. Liesel then comments again that he isn't the person the man is looking for, showing his guild card. At that moment, 2 guards arrive because of the commotion. The black-haired man who had appeared earlier slips away. One of the guards asks Liesel for a moment, thinking he is a noble, but Liesel says he'll leave the rest in their hands and walks away. Gil asks what he was plotting. Liesel reveals that he deliberately staged the whole scene, and we see the 2 of them follow the black-haired man. Liesel stops him to talk, but the man says he's busy. The albino mentions that he brought a letter addressed to him, but even then the man doesn't pay attention. Then Liesel asks him to invite them to eat, since they were nearly killed after being mistaken for him. Faced with that, the man agrees. Elsewhere, Liesel says it's an honor to meet the Count, but the man interrupts him, saying he knows Liesel doesn't like that title, and asks him to call him Shadow instead, also asking who Liesel is. Liesel replies that he's just an adventurer. Shadow recognizes Gil as the Thrust, commenting that even when traveling in a group, he hasn't softened in the slightest. Setting that aside, Shadow says he wants to talk about the matter, but Liesel gets distracted by how delicious the food is. Even Gil asks for another bottle. Shadow tells them to get straight to the point, so Liesel shows the letter, and Shadow only reacts when he sees the seal. Shadow asks how Liesel managed to get along with him. Liesel explains that he accepted a job in the labyrinths and liked the fact that the items were sent properly packaged. To Shadow, Roy is a complete idiot. He wonders whether Roy accepted Liesel at his side or truly considers him someone important. Either way, he assumes Roy wants him to get along with Liesel. This is confirmed when he reads the letter, in which Roy warns him not to turn Liesel into an enemy. From this, Shadow deduces that Liesel is no ordinary adventurer and asks how he figured out he was a count. Liesel replies that it was from his appearance, since a book he read described someone identical to him. He also realized it because of the commotion. At first, Shadow was observing from afar, but when people started talking about him, he approached. As if that weren't enough, Liesel noticed that Shadow fixed his gaze on him and came closer out of concern for Fel. All of that led him to figure out who Shadow was and approach him to deliver the letter. Although Shadow knows there's more to it, Liesel says he just wants to do some sightseeing in Mercady for a few days and spoke to him so he could get invited to eat on the very first day. With that, he says goodbye, thanking him. As Shadow rereads the letter, he comments to Roy that he didn't need to write that. At that exact moment, the waitress brings the bill, and upon seeing it, he crumples the paper in anger. Meanwhile, our protagonist and Gil return home. The black-haired man notices the provocation and asks if something is wrong. Liesel replies that he simply thought he needed to make a big impression so the man would remember him, nothing more. He then asks Gil if he doesn't think it's dangerous for the Lord of the Realm to walk around alone. Gil explains that he has someone with him. This surprises the protagonist, who asks if that person is strong. Gil replies that he doesn't know. At that moment, Judge appears along with the mourning soldiers. The protagonist approaches and asks what he's doing there. The redhead says he heard about the attack, since the police went to his house. Liesel apologizes for the trouble and asks the officers if there was any serious issue that required them to look for him at that hour. The blonde officer replies that no, they just need to confirm both sides' accounts. Thus, Liesel hands over his adventurer's card and explains the misunderstanding with the merchant. Once everything is cleared up, the officer returns the card. Liesel thanks him, but points out that coming after him at that hour is inappropriate. Judge tries to intervene, but Gil silences him as they both understand the situation. Liesel begins to confront them with direct remarks, asking why they were in such a hurry to find them if the culprit had already been caught and the situation resolved. The officer doesn't know what to say. However, Gil understands perfectly that they did this because it would tarnish their reputation if adventurers had solved the case. At that moment, the officer's partner yells at the protagonist to stop complaining, saying they were just protecting him. This attitude irritates Gil. Lisel comments that it seems he's a big admirer of his. The blonde officer apologizes, but the other repeats that he only made the thrust protect him. Hearing this, Lisel warns that Gil hates people who mix emotions with work. The officer backs off. Meanwhile, Gil is playing around with Judge. Lisel asks him to put him down. When he does, Judge runs over to Lisel to complain. Through tears, he turns to the officers and threatens them, saying that if they try anything against Lisel, he will never forgive them. This frightens the two officers a little. Gil is surprised by how much power the words of a merchant family hold in that place. Lisel, for his part, asks Judge not to say things like that, though he also thanks him, which makes the redhead happy. With nothing more to say, they ask the officers to take Judge home. They say their goodbyes, and finally our protagonist and Gil also go to sleep. On a new day, Gil wakes up and, taking advantage of the fact that Lisel won't wake up for a while, starts reading a book, without realizing that they are being watched by a mysterious guy. They both go to have breakfast. While they are eating, a man dressed elegantly hands them a leaflet about an auction. This catches the attention of our protagonist, who discusses the matter with Gil O. A boy with black hair comments that perhaps they are auctioning off unique books from the labyrinth and asks if he would like to go. The protagonist responds that in fact he intended to visit some bookstores, but when he sees that the auction starts at 3, he considers the possibility of going if he finishes everything quickly, so they agree to go. After a while, we see Lisel walking through the city looking for bookstores. He finds one and goes in to look for some books. After a while, he chooses some volumes, and even asks the owner to recommend one for him. The old man accepts with pleasure, and, guided by for the books that Lisel intends to buy, chooses one especially for him. Lisel realizes that the work is similar to a book she had already read. The old man explains that that work is practically dialoguing directly with the book he read previously. The protagonist starts reading right there, but the old man asks him to do so after buying it. Lisel apologizes, and then, after paying everything, he politely asks the old man to recommend a good bookstore. The old man gives him directions and writes them down on a small piece of paper. Thus, we see Lisel traveling through the city, without realizing that the same guy from the morning was watching him again. After a while, the protagonist arrives at the place where he had agreed to meet Gil, and discovers the black-haired boy surrounded by 2 women who ask him out. Lisel watches the scene. However, when Gil notices his presence, he orders him to get him out of that situation. Thus, Lisel intervenes, causing him to the women leave alone. Gil complains about him just watching Lisel, but he calms him down, saying that at least those ladies were very polite. Gil gets angry and tells him to come in. Then, we see them at reception, and the same guy from the morning hands them a sign with a number. And wish you a good stay. Already in the hall, the presenter begins the Great Merchandise Subasta, issue number 23. The first item is a low-level healing potion. Coming from a labyrinth, one person offers 4 silver coins, another 5 silver coins, and 10 copper coins. Lisel asks Gil if the potions vary according to the labyrinth, and he responds that they are normally very painful, although some are not. In the end, the potion is sold for 9 silver coins. The next item is a painting highly coveted by collectors, nobles, and commoners alike. The opening bid for this subasta is made of a gold coin. Lisel recognizes the painting and laughs, because M and her group appear at the bottom, and they are also walking in the opposite direction. After selling the painting, it is offered an original strategy guide. Taken from a maze chest, Lisel asks Gil about it, and he explains that the book teaches how to complete the maze he came out of and shows the strategy to do so. The book contains maps of each floor, information about the monsters, such as their habits and the materials that can be obtained. This book also starts with a toss of a coin. Gold, others offer more, but Lisel realizes that those competing don't seem to be adventurers. Gil remembers that they are collectors and that furthermore, adventurers don't need this type of book, since it only appears in the last level. Have you ever imagined how difficult it is to reach the deepest level? All this just to receive a book that tells you everything you already know. Even if it describes the monsters that appear, you won't defeat them just by reading. The maps aren't useful either, since the guild itself sells them. The book costs 8 gold coins, yet Lisel ends up offering 10. Gil asks what he wants it for, and Lisel responds that she wants to know the strategy guide. Soon, someone offers 12 coins, but Lisel goes up to 15, continuing until she reaches 20, thus beating the book auction. Lisel asks Gil if he wants something, and he responds that he is a difficult enemy to defeat. On the other hand, we see Shadow. He receives a report about Lisa. The only thing they tell you is that he likes books. Shadow still finds it difficult. believe he just came for a walk, so you decide to stop following him. Anyway, they attract a lot of attention, so if something happens, he'll find out the next day. We see Liesel having breakfast, and he was coming from a fight. Gil comments that he would like to face someone strong. Liesel asks if there is anyone he would have difficulty beating, but lately there is no one. So Liesel shows him a drawing of the crystal ruins that are very close to there. Gil mentions that many tourists usually go there as the place is very beautiful. Furthermore, the guild wins money guiding people through the first floor, and they are certainly happy when a monster appears, because if an adventurer needs to fight, this generates extra income. Liesel comments that the country merchant really thinks like a merchant. Gil observes that he likes to confirm everything on his own. Liesel asks if he would like to do the same. Gil points out that the guides have no errors, but Liesel responds by asking if the guild map wouldn't also have flaws. Gil replies no, since hundreds of adventurers completed it. In this case, Liesel shows a notebook where it appears a room that is not on the guild map. Furthermore, he points out that this room also appears on another page of the book, but as if it were on a deeper level. He asks if perhaps it is a trap, and questions the possibility of finding something really worthwhile. Gil comments that there are usually valuable items from labyrinths or very strong enemies. Liesel is interested in the idea. He asks Gil if he could accompany him, and the black-haired boy replies yes. After all, he sees no reason not to go. Liesel mentions that perhaps she could hinder him in the face of an enemy powerful. Gil makes it clear that he never considered him a nuisance. Furthermore, if it were an ordinary hidden room, it would have already been discovered, so he does not consider himself capable of handling it alone. Two go together and arrive at the maze. As they walk through the corridors, Liesel comments that nothing ever breaks inside the maze. Gil responds that these places are indestructible. Without further ado, arrive at the portal. Gil asks which floor the secret passage would be on. Liesel replies that it is on floor 19. So, Gil suggests going to the 20th floor, and, as soon as they reach the 20th, they are greeted by a bear. However, Gil defeats it with a single blow. Liesel demonstrates her discomfort with that action, but does not delve deeper into the subject, and they continue advancing. After climbing the stairs, they enter a corridor. At a certain point, Liesel stops and indicates that the room is inside that wall. There is no mechanism to open it. The protagonist uses his pistol, and with several shots, manages to locate the entrance. Immediately, Gil breaks the wall, revealing the entrance to the secret room. Walking for a few seconds, they arrive at the room La. They find a chest, and upon opening it, Zay discovers a map of a completely ordinary forest. As they try to decipher it, a magic circle activates under them, their feet, and suddenly they are teleported into a free fall. Both remain calm. However, Gil gets excited, hoping to finally encounter a powerful enemy. As he focuses his vision, he concludes that if it's about a dragon, the beast launches its breath and Gil orders Liesel to hold on tight, because with his current armor he will only feel heat. Liesel, in turn, fears that some of her things will burn, and suggests trying to open a tunnel in the middle using his magic. Gil agrees and says he will warn at the right time. So, Liesel prepares her pistol, and when the fireball gets close enough, Gil warns to shoot. Liesel fires, creating a space through which they can pass. This way, they finally reach the dragon. Gil suggests that Liesel rest, since he no longer has magic. As he advances, he draws his sword, and suddenly, they appear back at the inn. While Gil cleans his sword, Liesel comments that she doesn't like people seeing him trembling due to lack of magic. He doesn't remember leaving. If anyone has seen him like this before, he has also never screamed in pain, and lately, he hasn't even complained. He admits that, although it would be easier not to, contain himself. He has gotten used to acting this way, confessing that when he's with Gil, he ends up being too spoiled, which doesn't seem right to him, since he's not used to living with someone who's his equal. After saying that, he goes to rest, while Gil comments that he should depend on him more, without so much hesitation. In another scene, we see a man running. He is Lord Liesel's direct secretary. He tries to talk to the king, but the guards won't let him through. He says it's an emergency and then shouts that Lord Liesel has disappeared. The door is kicked open. A guy asks where this happened. Secretário responde que foi em escritório e eles são transportados até lá. Essa é uma habilidade que apenas a realeza pode usar. Ele pergunta o que aconteceu. The secretary explains that Liesel was sitting, talking to him, and suddenly he disappeared. He was just organizing documents, and when he blinked, Liesel was no longer there. At that moment, he calls for Liesel while analyzing the entire document. Space of the room. He asks about the earrings. The secretary replies that he was wearing this, which makes him even more confused as he cannot feel their presence. Those earrings were created by His Majesty, pouring all the magic possible on them, and if they didn't react, it's because Liesel isn't there. Then, an old man enters. They explain everything that happened and ask him what he thinks about it. The old man asks them to consider what he will say as the madness of an old man and says that the world has two faces, where there is a world parallel to this one. The one who told him this was a friend whose grandfather, a long time ago, would have come from this other world to him. This seems like a big lie, but they can try. Furthermore, if Liesel is still in this world, she will return on her own. However, if he is gone, although it will be necessary to rescue him. Meanwhile, he will look in every corner where Liesel may be, warning that he will be gone for a while. The next morning, Liesel wakes up and realizes that Gil is uncovered, so she goes to cover him, but he was also already awake and comments that he woke up early today. Liesel apologizes for waking him up, but he responds that he always gets up at this time. The protagonist suggests that he rest, since he had a very difficult fight yesterday. Even so, Gil says he's fine. When he notices his muscles, Liesel touches her own body to see if she also has muscles. After that, the two go to Gremio. Hello. Again, they mistake Liesel for a nobleman, but recognize Gil. They approach the receptionist, who asks what they want. Liesel responds that she wants to update the map of the labyrinth called Crystal Ruins. The girl is surprised and repeats the name out loud, drawing everyone's attention. She comments that the labyrinth is very old, that it has already been fully explored, and that it has not been updated for years. However, Liesel says that she found something new. At that moment, another adventurer approaches and warns that it is very dangerous to provide false information. Insinuating that he just wants to show off for Layla, the receptionist Liesel comments that Layla is a very lovely name and thanks her for the compliment. The adventurer is annoyed to see that he started flirting and questions how someone as delicate as Liesel could have discovered something new in that maze. Demanding proof, Liesel asks Layla if it's really. It is necessary to present evidence to update the map. She answers no, because if it is a lie, someone will end up finding out, and this will ruin the adventurer's reputation. That's why no one usually lies. She then asks Liesel to continue. Still, the other adventurer says he doesn't believe it, but Liesel says she only cares about Gremio. If they want proof, he shows them the Gremio's strategy guide, Labyrinth, explaining that he found it in a hidden room along with a treasure. The adventurers are excited by the news, but are discouraged when they learn that they kept the treasure. Even so, Liesel, he comments that it's worth going into the maze because at the bottom there was a monster. Layla immediately interrupts him and asks him to reveal more details. Liesel obeys and says it's the first time he's delivered information, asking if she should explain everything in detail. Layla answers yes, because that way he will receive a bigger reward, and asks you to wait while you prepare everything. She places a device on the table and asks them both to come closer. When you lower the lever, a sphere grows and surrounds them. The device works like a silencer so that no one can hear the conversation. Layla asks him to continue. Liesel explains that there was a wall that looked normal, but it was the only part that could be broken. For Layla, this makes sense, since mazes are normally indestructible. Lisa adds that it was a thick wall, but Gil broke it with a kick. Layla is impressed, even more so since it is a wall of crystal which is extremely resistant. He goes on to say that beyond the wall, there was an altar and a chest. When the chest was opened, a spell was activated and teleported them to another room, where they were falling for 2 minutes. Layla asks if they weren't hurt in the fall, but upon observing them, she concludes that they weren't. Liesel adds that at the bottom there was a dragon that attacked them as soon as they arrived. Layla knocks on the table and asks him to stop, saying that it's too much information. At that moment, Liesel notices something strange. Layla begins to excitedly repeat everything she heard, and then realizes that the silencer was deactivated since everyone was listening. Liesel decides to show one more proof, an underground dragon scale. He asks the adventurer if he now believes in him, and the man responds yes. Liesel leaves the scale at the guild as proof. Layla asks if he is sure, as he could make a lot of money selling it. However, Gil had removed several scales, so he didn't care. It matters. The receptionist asks for Liesel's guild card and he gives it to her. When she sees his rank, she gets confused. Liesel asks if everything is okay, and remaining calm, she recommends that he do the process to rise in rank. But Liesel refuses, saying that he has less than 2 months as an adventurer, and that there is a boy who would be upset if he rose in rank in another guild. It seems that Gil becomes jealous, because in his mind he highlights that Liesel is spoiling study again. Without further ado, the receptionist delivers the reward, and the protagonists leave. As they walk through the city, Liesel asks if it would be a good idea to move up in rank, since even he finds it strange that the leader has an F rank. Gil makes it clear that it doesn't matter and that, regardless of who he is, he will always stay by his side. After a while, they arrive at the store. Lisa looks at the potions and praises the quality of the potions. Products, although they are not as good as those from George's store. While they are talking, an employee approaches and asks if they have an appointment with young George. The protagonist confirms, and the employee leads them to a room. When the employee leaves, George opens the door visibly altered. He apologizes for not having received them at the entrance and explains that his grandfather gave him many gifts, making him lose track of time. At that moment, his grandfather appears with even more gifts. Upon seeing Gil, he greets him with familiarity, and noticing that he is carrying the sword, asks if he is taking good care of her. With his usual defiant attitude, Gil responds, "Yes." The grandfather then notices the protagonist and asks who he is. Lizelle introduces herself and takes the opportunity to apologize for involving his grandson in his problems and disrupting his precious family time. The grandfather is disappointed, as he actually intended to complain about that very thing. Next, George asks the protagonist if he would like to have lunch with them. Since his grandfather wants to talk to both of them, Lisa accepts with pleasure. Upon hearing this, the grandfather smiles and finally introduces himself as Insight, thanking the protagonist for taking care of his grandson. During lunch, when he notices that Lisa is eating little, Insight asks him to eat heartily. Our protagonist confesses that, although it doesn't seem like it now, he eats much more than before. Changing the subject, he asks Gil how long they have known each other and if he was the one who recommended that sword. Gil replies that it has been 2 years, but denies having recommended it. Weapon, remembering that, as he didn't know which weapon suited him, the old man ended up giving him that sword. Therefore, Lizel asks if he would have a sword for him too. The grandfather thinks this is absurd and asks to see his current weapon. Lizel then takes out his pistol. When observing her closely, Insight asks why he would want a sword if he can handle it. Analyzing every detail of the weapon, it highlights how unusual she is. Jorge asks what he's referring to. Grandfather explains that the weapon works with magical energy, something that few magicians can control with such precision. Jorge then understands that Lisel must be someone extraordinary. However, the grandfather corrects him, saying that he is not exactly a genius, but someone very skilled at what he does, as he can aim, adjust his posture, control the recoil, and even pull the trigger using magic. To explain better, he gives an example. He asks them to imagine a melody in their mind, then add a different one and continue playing both at the same time. According to him, this is what Lisel does. The protagonist denies being capable of something like that, but then clarifies that it was just an example to illustrate how peculiar the functioning of his mind is. After that, while they were eating the dessert, Jorge gets up saying he's going to prepare everything for the match. Insight tries to stop him, but he ignores him and leaves. Taking advantage of the fact that they were alone, Lisel asks her grandfather for a favor. He hands over a piece of paper and asks him to deliver it in his name. When he opens it, Insight sees that it is a map of Mercade's underground walkways and asks where he got it. Liesel replies that it was by chance, as he came inside a book he bought at an auction and asks him to give it to Count Shadow, since he knows him. Insight asks why he thinks that, and Liesel replies that it was written in the book. He comments that the merchant Mercadia contributed a lot to the development of Mercade, so he assumes that if his ancestors helped, Encide also helps. He adds that Jorge is a good guy, with great sense of duty, so if he was raised by Insight, his grandfather must also be like that. Insight laughs and agrees, saying that if he knows the Count's name, it's because he already knew him. Lisel confirms that he did, because they had dinner together. Insight imagines that Shadow must have enjoyed talking to someone capable of challenging him. Before handing over the document, he asks if he should say that it was Lisel or whoever sent it. Protagonist responds that he can tell, but that the Count will probably frown when he finds out. Precisely for this reason, Insight says that he will tell her even more willingly. Then, Lisel also shows the scales of dragon and makes another wish. On the website, he recognizes that they are scales from an underground dragon and asks what he intends to do with them. Lisa wants him to buy them and, when he resells them, publicly announce their origin account, who got them in the crystal ruins. On the website, he imagines that it must be a huge dragon, but he is not surprised that Gil defeated him. He asks if it was the boss of the labyrinth, but they explain that it was the lord of a hidden room and who have already informed Gremio. On the website, you understand the intention. When the scales go to market, the adventurers will know that the dragon exists, although some doubt it because Lisa, being rank F Isael, comments that the labyrinth is a famous tourist spot and that, if tourists disappear, the city will lose a large source of income. On the website, you like the way he thinks and decides evaluate the scales immediately. Grandfather calls George, but he says he's busy. However, when Lisa calls him, he shows up right away. leaving the site depressed over the difference in treatment. Before they leave, Grandpa pays for the scales. George announces that he has finished packing his things, including Grandpa's gifts. He also took tools that cannot be stored in space magic. Grandpa. He asks where he bought that, and George replies that it was in that store he always talks about. Despite not having much variety, he managed to buy everything for a fair price. Liesel and Gil comment that the owner is a good merchant and very persistent, ready to leave. Liesel and Insight talk a little more. The grandfather asks him to take care of George, but the protagonist states that it won't be necessary, as he already is a true merchant. After that, Insight tries to convince his grandson to stay a little longer, but George ignores the request and says goodbye. At night, the boys camp in the middle of the forest. Liesel he offers to hold the vigil, and Gil accepts, saying that he entrusts the safety to him. While Liesel is in front of the fire, an arrow is shot in her direction. However, Gil deflects it with the dagger. Surprised, Liesel asks if he was really sleeping, and Gil replies yes. Soon, another rain of arrows begins. Gil realizes that they are common ambush arrows, concluding that they are bandits. He blocks the shots while Lisa uses her gun to take down the enemies. But he notices that one of them managed to dodge the shot. The bandits then reveal their face, but the most skilled man runs away. Liesel asks what they feel about being abandoned. The redhead tells him to shut up and states that he will regret catching the attention of the Fork Gang. Upon hearing the name, Liesel asks if that is the boss's name. While speaking, he notices something strange in the carriage. Taking advantage of the distraction, a bandit advances, but Gil defeats him with a single blow. With no alternative, the two face the rest, and after a while, all the bandits are lying on the ground. They decide to get out of there as soon as possible, and Gil offers to drive the carriage. Liesel finds the decision strange, but Gil makes it clear that it is so that he can take care of George. Thus, Liesel enters the carriage and finds George scared. He reassures him, promising that everything will be fine. George says he is not afraid of the bandits, but rather that something will happen to Liesel. He calms him down and asks him to try to sleep. Jorge accepts with the condition that he holds her hand. The two are left in peace. Shortly after, Gil comes in to check if everything is okay. Liesel asks him to take care of the rest. Gil agrees and suggests that he also rest. So everyone ends up sleeping, and Gil can't help but comment that Liesel spoils George too much. And, well, if you got this far, comment on the word scale to show that you made it to the end.